This evening I want to look at the different kinds of equanimity, upekkha. It's a very important central spiritual quality, and it comes in different flavors, you might say. The Visuddhimagga has a list of 10 different kinds of equanimity, and I knew I wouldn't remember them all, so rather than embarrass myself getting stuck, I printed them out. The general idea of upekkha is it's translated as equanimity or sometimes neutrality. It's evenness of mind, steadiness, uh, not being disturbed by external or internal events and stimulus, but remaining calm and collected, focused. Of the 10 kinds, the first is called six-factored equanimity, and this is the equanimity of an arahant. It's called six-factored because of 6 sense bases. Whatever arises at the 6 sense bases, for one whose cankers are destroyed, meaning an arahant, the mode of non-abandonment of the natural state of purity, when desirable, undesirable objects of the 6 kinds come into focus at the 6 doors. So one thing this tells us is that nobody's going to have perfect equanimity unless you're an arahant. So don't be too hard on yourself. Don't be too judgmental. Oh, I should have been more equanimous. Realize, it's going to be a while before you're an arahant. So you're not going to have perfect equanimity until that time. But you can try. You can get as you should try to be as close to that as you can. And the way it's phrased, the arahant does not abandon the natural state of purity. So the natural state of an arahant is pure. And he's not moved from that state by any object that arises at the 6 sense doors, whether it's desirable or undesirable. For the rest of us, various objects arise constantly throughout the day, every day, in the 6 sense doors, through our 5 external senses and through the mind door. And the mind perceives them as desirable or undesirable, and there's a chance of being disturbed by them, losing your calm, equipoise, centered position and being shaken. When something unpleasant happens, you get upset. Something happy happens and you get giddy, you lose, either way you lose the calm equipoise. It's related, one of the qualities of an arahant is the ability to see the desirable in the undesirable and the undesirable in the desirable as he chooses. So it's not moved by external events, but can see everything in its totality and choose to focus on which aspect is suitable at the moment. The second one in the list is equanimity as a divine abiding, as a Brahma Vihara. As you know, there are 4 Brahma Viharas: metta, loving kindness; karuna, compassion; mudita, sympathetic joy; and upekkha, equanimity. Of the 4, upekkha has a special place. The way the Visuddhimagga talks about it, it could be described as the grad school of Brahma Viharas. That the recommendation in the Visuddhimagga is first you gain mastery in at least one of the other 3, meaning ease of entering jhana before you practice equanimity. That advice is probably overly restrictive. It represents a sort of developed rigid system that is expressed in the formal scholastic kind of system represented in the Visuddhimagga, which is quite a late text. I don't think you have to take that literally. I don't think you have to refrain from trying to practice equanimity before you master one of the other three. But it does express the reality that it transcends the other three, so it's more refined and more subtle, and hence more difficult to actually practice. The other three are all of a piece. They all represent variations on the same theme. You practice Brahmavihara metta, you're establishing well-wishing towards all beings. May beings be well and happy. And if you practice karuna, you're developing a wish that beings do not suffer. And mudita is the wish that beings continue to enjoy their happiness. So what these have in common is there's some aspiration. So there's some intention in the mind to change things as they are, so beings can be happy and not suffer and so forth. Upekkha is different in that there's no intention expressed. It's simply a recognition and acceptance of beings as they are. The traditional formula for that contemplation is all beings are the owners of their karma, heirs of their karma, abide supported by their karma, and so forth. It's related to recognizing that whether beings are enjoying happiness or suffering, it's a result of their karma. So there's nothing more than simply a recognition of the fact this is the reality. That traditional contemplation is rather abstract and theoretical, difficult to hold in the mind, to grasp. I heard a variation on that I picked up in reading one of the Dalai Lama's talks that he gave someplace. He was talking about equanimity, and he suggested using the contemplation, this being just wants happiness, does not want suffering. It's not a wish that they be happy, that they don't suffer, but it's a recognition they want to be happy, they don't want to suffer. What both of these, whether the traditional one or this different suggested one, would have in common is that they're looking at beings and focusing on that which is universal, which is common for all beings. There's a infinite multitude of beings in the universe, and they can be classified, categorized in numerous ways. There's humans and animals and devas and petas. There's male and female. There's large and small, old and young, strong and weak, near and far. There's infinite numbers of ways you can classify beings, focusing on their particularities. But with this contemplation, you're cutting through all of that and trying to focus on that aspect of beings which is the same, which is universal. Two aspects of wisdom are the discriminating wisdom and the wisdom of equality. And both are aspects of wisdom, and both have their place and are essential. The aspect of wisdom, which is the discriminating wisdom, is able to distinguish this from that. In particular, is often the distinguishment between that which is skillful and that which is unskillful. But it could be any kind of distinction between that which is red and that which is blue, between that which is old and that which is new, whatever. Is the ability to distinguish the particularities of things. So you have a sharpness and a crispness of mind, and you're able to see this and that and understand and know the difference. The other aspect of wisdom is the penetrating wisdom that sees the sameness underlying all things, that all sankharas or dhammas have essential qualities the same. We'll return to this point in one of the later wisdoms, but how this applies here to the equanimity about beings is here you're focusing on the sameness of beings. So it's the wisdom of equality you're looking at. There is that aspect of beings that no matter whether they're smart or dumb or old or young or big or small, they have some quality the same, that they just want happiness, don't want suffering. And they abide supported by their karma. They're the result of their karma. They're dependently arisen. So equanimity as a Brahma Vihara is accepting that the universal reality of things as they are, and in terms of beings. The third one in the list is equanimity as an enlightenment factor, as one of the 7 enlightenment factors, or bojjhanga, which could be translated as wings of awakening. It's a poetic kind of translation that Thanissaro has used. It's quite literal. That's what boj is a derivative from the same root as budo. It means to wake. The verb is bujati. And anga is it means like a part, a section, and it can refer to a bird's wing or a limb of a person. So bojjhanga could be wings of awakening. And there's 7 of these, and this is one of the lists that has a balancing characteristic. That sati is mindfulness, is one of the 7, and that's considered to be in the center and is useful at all times. The Visuddhimagga says, like salt in every dish, which is kind of a doubtful culinary advice, but that's the idea that mindfulness is useful at all times. I think Buddhaghosa was probably not much of a cook. And the other 6 are divided into 2 groups of 3. 3 of them are energizing factors and 3 are calming factors. So that this is one of these groupings that's useful in developing steadiness in meditation, centeredness, not going to extremes, by developing that side which you're weak on, and you need sati, mindfulness, to be able to know that. So equanimity is part of the calming group, along with passaddhi, tranquility, and samadhi. Samadhi, passaddhi, and upekkha are the calming factors. The energizing factors are virya, which is energy or effort, piti, which is joy or happiness, the joyfulness that comes from samadhi, and Dhamma Vichaya, investigation of Dhammas. So equanimity has its place in that list as a calming factor. It has that characteristic, that quality of steadiness, evenness, that allows the mind to be calm because it's non-reactive. Then there's equanimity, number 4, is equanimity of energy. When the energy is balanced, it's neither too stressful or too relaxed. And this is something that comes up again and again talking about meditation, is that the necessity to develop that calm steadiness of energy, that whenever you go off the center point, is either you fall off either to the left or the right, you fall off either into restlessness and overstimulation, or you fall off into dullness and drowsiness. And a large part of the skill of meditating well is learning to balance the energy so it's neither too jagged and make you restless and jumpy, and or neither too lax so you get sleepy and dull. And to find that central balance point, which is a kind of equanimity, that equipoise, that balance, it's a very fine balance. It's like walking a razor's edge. You fall off one way or the other, or you stay exactly poised on the center. The fifth one given on this list is equanimity about formations, which is a technical term for a specific stage in vipassana practice, in the development of insight. And a lot can be said about this state of mind. It's a very important state in the development of a meditator. In developing insight, there's a long list of stages. There's 20-something stages that are listed in the commentaries, and Mahasi Sayadaw has written extensively about the stages of insight, that the mind goes through different states of mind as it develops further and further. And some of them are perceived as kind of a crisis, that the mind begins to see the reality of samsara, that everything is transient and uncertain, and the body is falling away and decaying underneath you, even as you sit there, and nothing can be relied on, and everything is unsatisfying and impermanent. But you haven't yet seen beyond that. So if you can experience states of fear, states of despair, and so on. This can be compared in, this is the Buddhist version of, in Christian mysticism, they talk about the dark night of the soul. It's kind of a difficult passage that the mind can come across. It's like the rose-colored glasses have fallen off, and you can no longer fool yourself. You no longer live in a Disney cartoon. This is real. This is raw, and it can be frightening, and it can cause a meditator to give up and back away. But there's an old saying: the way out is down and through. If you have that courage and ferocity to just keep going irregardless, and you come out the other side of that, and you realize, oh, things are impermanent, they are suffering, they are empty, so what? And this is equanimity of formations. Equanimous because you're not disturbed by anything. The mind is completely at peace and at ease, but fully awake and mindful. This state is very pleasant to be in because of its peacefulness and clarity. And it doesn't feel like you're doing anything. It doesn't feel like you're making an effort to meditate, although you're meditating pretty well perfectly. You're just sitting there, and stuff's happening, and you're fully aware of it, and nothing disturbs you. And it doesn't matter whether it's something wonderful or something terrifying. You just see it as another object. It's just impermanent, suffering, empty. And it just passes through. And the mind is quite clear and calm. And it's very purifying and healing for the body and mind to sit in that state. It's in itself very beneficial. But it's not enlightenment. It's not the end of the road. What it is the jumping off place. It's the position from which awakening can happen. It cannot happen anywhere else. It's only the mind that has that loose a grip on samsara that can make the critical leap sideways and realize that which is not this. It lights upon non-occurrence and experiences the unconditioned. And it's not something you can do, it's not something you look for, It's just samsara. You just stop doing samsara. Because there, at that point, there's no passion for samsara. It neither fascinates nor terrifies. It's just stopped happening, and it's almost like you get bored of samsara and the mind sort of takes a little sidestep and sees what else is there. It's said in Mahasi Sayadaw's writings, who, as I say, has written extensively about these matters, and in a very practical way, very technical, but practical for meditators. He says that it's impossible to remain in a state of equanimity about formations for more than about 4 to 6 hours, usually. If the mind doesn't alight upon nibbana during that time, it'll fall back one stage to what's called knowledge of reobservation, which is a stage marked by a certain degree of restlessness. And if the meditator is aware of that, what's happening, the advice is to remain very still and fight the restlessness. And you'll get through that and get back to equanimity of formations in a while. And you'll cycle in and out of that. So that's a very important technical concept in the meditation path, is equanimity about formations. Number 6 is given as equanimity as a feeling, neither pleasant nor unpleasant feeling. We've been talking about pretty advanced meditative states, but now this is a very mundane, ordinary kind of upekkha that we experience innumerable times through the day, and it's a natural, normal phenomena of the mind, that we have these 3 feelings: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And neutral feeling is an aspect of equanimity, because the mind takes an object, is not moved by it. If you're not fully mindful of pleasant feelings, that leads to craving and desire. If you're not fully mindful of unpleasant feelings, that leads to ill will and anger. If you're not fully mindful of neutral feeling, that leads to delusion and dullness. Neutral feelings are very subtle and difficult to notice, because they are neutral, they don't stand out. I feel like a strong pleasant feeling or a strong unpleasant feeling is obvious. Pain and pleasure, and they're the kind of motivating forces of unenlightened worldlings, beings in the world. They're pushed and pulled by pain and pleasure, but neutrality is just there. And I think probably if you were able to keep a tally, a running total during the day of all your feelings at each moment, pleasant, neutral, unpleasant, pleasant, neutral, and keep a running total, I would bet that most times neutral feelings would be the biggest category. Things just boring old neutral. It's neither really good, neither really bad. There's also some, should mention, there's also some controversy whether there is such a thing as a purely neutral, 0-point neutral feeling, or whether it refers to a spectrum of mildly pleasant to mildly unpleasant. There may be some slight reaction of the mind one way or the other. Leave that to the Abhidhamma controversialists to hash that out. I don't think it's really a very practical point, but except that if you're trying to look at feelings in meditation, you can take that classification of very mild feelings as neutral. that can be useful to realize this subtle movement of the mind. And I think as far as feelings go, it's a very elementary, basic, Vedana is a very elementary, rudimentary level of mental activity. I think maybe one of the first mental factors to evolve in life forms. That it makes sense from the biological point of view that organisms will classify their environment as pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. If I can eat it or mate with it, it's pleasant. If it can eat me, then it's unpleasant, and everything else is neutral. And if you're some kind of little bug or something, that's a useful way to parse the universe. Then the seventh one is given as equanimity about insight, neutrality about observation, what exists, what has become, that he abandons, and he obtains equanimity. So this is a kind of a general aspect of equanimity related to mindfulness, that whatever is observed is seen as coming into being and passing out of being, and it's just a factor of observation. And this is something that the kind of equanimity that comes from being centered in the citta. That if you're centered in the knowing mind, that which knows, then all the phenomena that's passing through the mind is not identified with, not attached to, not validated or believed in, then the mind is at peace. That where we get into trouble is when we identify with and validate our mental reactions, our mental formations. If anger arises in the mind, then if you're centered in the citta, you just see that as a mental phenomenon of anger, and it passes quickly because you're not identifying with it, you're not feeding it. But if you go into it and identify with it and have the implicit assumption, I am the anger, and you validate it, you find reasons to justify it, then it persists and becomes dominant in the mind and causes you suffering. And the same with all the other passions and emotions that run through the mind. If you're able to just see them as mental factors, it's not me, not mine. This is just something I'm observing. Think of them as weather storming, raging outside the window. You're in a nice, cozy, warm cabin looking out the window, fire's crackling, and you're looking out the window at the blizzard roaring by. You're aware of it, but it doesn't affect you. Then number 8 is an important one, is equanimity as specific neutrality. This is the mental factor. It's one of the 50 chittasakas, one of the 50 mental factors analyzed in the Abhidhamma. And it's the specific kind of upekkha that applies in mindfulness, expressed in terms of a single mind moment. Now, this is a factor that arises associated with a mindful awareness. One of the factors is specific neutrality. That's Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, and it's become pretty well standard because it's a very good translation. It's what it means. It means you're neutral about this specific thing. The Pali is Tatra Majjhatthata, and if you break it down, what it literally, the root the roots of the different parts of the compound mean is the state of being in the middle about that. The state of middleness, or being in the middle about that. Tatra means that. So we're not just being generally in the middle in a fuzzy way, but we're being in the middle about that. And that is whatever the object is at this moment. That's why the specific in specific neutrality comes in and is very important. This is a very important aspect of developing vipassana, of developing clear seeing, is the specificity, the momentary sharpness. That's why in the Mahasi method they use the noting practice, making a mental note of objects. The idea of that noting is to develop the specificity, to see this particular Dhamma that's arising in the mind right now, specifically, and to see it with neutrality, to not take ownership of it. So this is the kind of upekkha that cuts the deepest. We talked about equanimity as a Brahma Vihara. That's equanimity directed towards beings, which is a very loose, broad kind of equanimity compared to this. This is equanimity directed towards Dhammas. And Dhamma is an individual mind moment, an object arising at a single mind moment. I like the translation of Dhamma in this meaning by the Russian scholar Sherbatsky. He calls a point instant. Is the sort of the simplest, most basic level of reality you can find. Is one object for one moment right now. And when it arises to the mind, you're specifically aware of it, you're keenly aware of it, and you're neutral. It doesn't sway you one way or the other, either to attraction or repulsion. And then you have tatra majjhatthata, specific neutrality. The ninth one is listed as purifying equanimity. Equanimity purified of all opposition, and so consisting in uninterestedness in stilling opposition, associated with fourth jhana. This is the kind of equanimity that's experienced as a factor in fourth jhana. The progress through the jhanas is increasingly towards the subtle, from the coarse to the subtle, and it's a relative. Those are relative terms. What seems subtle at one stage is perceived as coarse in the succeeding stage. So to begin with, the ordinary mind, sense experience can seem subtle. And obviously there's a whole spectrum of sense experience. Some of it is coarse and some of it is more subtle. Now you could think, I think of the example of music, which is a sense experience. You think there's so many different genres of music, and some of them are coarse relative to others. Think of some head-banging punk rock, compared to a Mozart concerto. There's a progression. There's many fine gradations in experience of music, and whatever kind of music, somewhere in the middle, you're experiencing it's subtle relative to something below it, and it's coarse relative to something above it. But they're all sense experience, even the most refined music. And then in first jhana, the mind transcends interest in the senses, and everything to do with the senses seems coarse and heavy and unwanted. It seems gross to the mind. The mind withdraws from the senses. and it relies on vitakka vichara primarily, the thought process of the mind, and piti and sukha are present. And then the thought forms, the ideation of the mind begins to seem coarse and unwanted, and is left behind in second jhana, which is dominated by piti. There's a rapture quality. And that's very subtle relative to thought, or very subtle relative to sense experience. But to third jhana, it seems coarse. And the mind withdraws to bliss, sukha. And then in fourth jhana, even bliss seems coarse. And the mind withdraws to equanimity, to purified equanimity. And this is an important parallel here between the samadhi development and the vipassana development. That the upper reaches of both paths come to rest in equanimity. There's equanimity about formations, and there's equanimity of fourth jhana. And there's this parallel is brought out by some of the modern meditation writers. And then the last one, and I've actually mixed up the order here. This should have been number 9, is equanimity of jhana, impartiality towards even the highest bliss. And this is again referring to fourth jhana. That well, it's referring really to the transition from third to fourth jhana. That third jhana is characterized by bliss, and the most purified kind of bliss. The most blissful beings in the whole universe are the Brahma gods of third jhana level. The most beautiful sound in the universe is heard on the second jhana level, where the beings cry out in beautiful musical voices, Aho Sukho, oh the happiness. But the ones in the third jhana level are too blissed out to make a noise. They're just silent, but they're the happiest, who experience the deepest happiness. But then the fourth jhana level transcends even that to rest in purified equanimity. One of the poetic tropes about the equanimity of fourth jhana is sukham parasukham, the bliss beyond bliss. So the happiness beyond happiness. You sort of maxed out the happiness and gone beyond that, transcended that into utter peacefulness. So there's all these different kinds of equanimity. But then the Visuddhimagga goes on to simplify this list and says that equanimity of energy and equanimity as a feeling are categories on their own, and the rest can be reduced into just two qualities: specific neutrality and equanimity about formations. No, I'm not really totally convinced by that simplification, but there is certainly a considerable overlap in the list. And this list doesn't even exhaust all the uses of equanimity that's found in the Buddha's teachings. There's equanimity as a paramita, as a parami. One of the 10 perfections of the Buddha was equanimity. And this is demonstrated in some of the Jataka stories, where he's an ascetic being tortured by an evil king and getting boiling oil poured on him and his limbs chopped off and so on, and he doesn't disturb his mind. He's still at peace. It's the perfection of equanimity. And it's important to to take them all together to see the importance of equanimity, the central place of equanimity in the Buddha's teachings, and to see how closely related it is to the development of mindfulness. That upekkha as a spiritual quality must be awake and mindful. And this is something that the Thai forest masters would often stress. Ajahn Chah talk about water buffalo equanimity as a false equanimity of the dull just being dull. You don't react to things because you're dull. You just don't see things, so you don't react. Whereas, like a water buffalo, there's a story that Ajahn Chah saw as he was walking around the monastery. He saw one of the monks. It looked like the roof of his kuti was damaged. And he went to see the monk to see what was going on, and then it was in the rainy season, and the monk had moved all his belongings into one corner that was still dry, and the rest of the place was all wet. Water was coming in. Ajahn Chah says, "Why don't you fix the roof?" And he says, "I'm trying to practice equanimity." And Ajahn Chah said, "That's the equanimity of a water buffalo." So it doesn't mean being dull and inactive. It means being calm and centered and clear and operating from a position of equipoise. That you're centered. Don't allow yourself to be thrown off that clear, calm center. And then you can perform many wonders and miracles from that position. You're not being jerked around by the stimulus and the emotions and the reactions.